Hi there and welcome to color saturation lesson, and this is super interesting. So let's go through how saturation works in drawings. Now, color saturation is how bright or pure color appears. The vibrancy of the color. Now, muted colors, they tend to retreat, meaning they feel like they are further away from the viewer, or like they are not so as a focus point, or they don't create a focus point. In the example drawing that you see here, you can clearly see that this is muted colors. You can divide these kind of like muted, and then we have saturated colors. Then we have saturation level from 0 to 100, and you can see that when you have some kind of like color wheel at your disposal, you can see that the saturation level, which is the S that you see here, hue 241, saturation 0, value 100, meaning white, value 0, black, and then we have saturation moving from 0 to 100. So 100 being the most saturated color that you can pick. At the middle, I tend to think that the middle point is neither saturated and neither muted or toned down color. And toned down colors tend to go from the halfway to the 0 level, and from 51 to 100 to more saturated colors. Now I've placed here different saturation values. So we have saturation 5 and 13, 72, 72. You can see that there's a huge difference between the saturation levels in this drawing. So we have very muted colors and super saturated colors, like the butterflies and flowers and flower petals and stuff like that. You can see that when the saturation is super high, which is kind of 72, it's pretty high, you can see that it takes the viewer's attention. You tend to see the flowers, you tend to see the butterfly, the centerpiece, because they are so vibrant. They are kind of like demanding your attention. That is super important to understand when using saturated colors. If every color in your drawing is super saturated, it's like screaming to your face, look at me, look at this. And when there's too much, the viewer cannot decide where to look at, because everything is kind of like saying, look at me. So use sparingly and with a thought of where to place saturated colors, because they become a focal point very quickly. Now this is a very simple example of how color saturation works. So you have like muted colors, which you can see here, and super saturated colors that you can see here. Here you can see that the color palette on the left side is retreating. It feels a bit more pleasant. It feels a bit more calm. It feels like it's not so demanding. The color palette on the kind of like on the right side, you can see it's advancing. There's like a lot of colors that are saturated. Well, all of the colors are actually super saturated. So if you check the saturation level is 63, 79, 79, 79 and 87. So they are very saturated colors. So when you look at this drawing, it feels like, where do I actually look at? What are the things that I should focus on? One thing that you probably focus on is the yellow, because it's not so, dominant. The primary colors are like green and blue here. But then we have like yellow dots, they are, complementary. So you kind of like, you can see the differentiation there. But all in all, the drawing on the right side, it's, for my eyes, it's not that pleasant to watch. On the left side, the drawing is more pleasant. It's easier to watch. But then again, there's no focus point. But also on the right side, we don't have any focus point because everything is super saturated. Now here's the drawing that has both. We have retreating colors, kind of like muted ones or toned down. And then we have advancing colors, which are the saturated colors. And as you can see, the color red, for example, it truly demands our focus. So when you are looking at the drawing, you more than likely you will see the whole drawing for sure, but you see the red quite, like it kind of like demands your attention. So even though the red things are not the focus point of the drawing, it should actually be the face. The thing is that as the red is super demanding, we kind of like look at those places, and where we see red, we kind of like focus on there. So carefully planning where to use saturated colors is super important, because if you use it, in let's say in a kind of like wrong way, you direct the viewer's attention to wrong places. So keep that in mind when you are choosing where to place saturated colors, or when you are using saturated colors, how you use them. I tend to do kind of like this split in my mind. So everything below the 50 level of saturation level is toned down, and everything above 50, meaning 51 to 100, is kind of like saturated colors. But if we truly think like at the 60 level, for example, are they super saturated? Probably not, but that's how I like to think. I like to think that the saturation level 0 to 50 is toned down, and something that I tend to use quite a lot. Also, one thing to note, this is super important, when you divide that into half and use primarily these colors, then the other half, if you use sparingly and don't use too much of these colors, they seem to be saturated. But then again, if we divide this into half using these colors only, and then few of these, it feels like they are like saturated colors and these are toned down. So it's all relation to the colors that you've picked for your drawing. But the higher kind of like level scale that you use, the easier it is to pick saturated and toned down colors. So that was all about color saturation. Hopefully you now kind of like understand how saturated colors and toned down colors work in a drawing. So toned down colors retreat, saturated colors advance and create focal points. Now let's move on to the next lesson.